Hello, everybody. Welcome to Floating Tacoma's Boat. I'm Susan Johnson. I work for the City of Tacoma as Historic Preservation Coordinator, and I will introduce our panelists in just a second, but I want to start off tonight with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are on the traditional homelands of the Puyallup tribe. The Puyallup people have lived on and stewarded these lands since the beginning of time and continue to do so today. We recognize that this land acknowledgement is one small step toward true allyship, and we commit to uplifting the voices, experiences, and histories of the Indigenous people of this land and beyond. I would also now like to welcome Stephanie Lyle and Claire Petrich. Stephanie, thank you. You are the Executive Director at the Harbor History Museum over in Gig Harbor. And Claire Petrich, your family, well, we're going to be talking about your family tonight. So yes, you are a maritime icon. Thank you so much for being here, both of you.
It's a real treat. Thank you for inviting us.
Let me share my screen. Sorry, I'm not always so good with the Zoom. You'd think by now. Share. Nope, go back up. There we go. So tonight's event, we are going to be talking about the history of Croatian boat building in the South Sound. This is going to be a very informal conversation, and if people who are listening tonight, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will try and get to as many as possible. So I know that the title does say, in some places it said Croatian boat builders and fishermen of the South Sound. We actually are probably going to split this event and have the fishing aspect for another event down in the future, because there's quite a bit to talk about with just the boat building. So I hope I didn't raise any expectations unnecessarily by having fishermen in the title, but we will get to them. Part 2. I'm gonna say that right now. So should I hand it over to Stephanie for some maps to locate us and where the places that we're talking about?
Sure. Are we, did you need to go through your slides, or are we just using them as talking points?
Oh, I can go to my next slide here.
Okay. Because I can share slides too, depending on what you prefer.
You go first. I'm going to stop mine.
Okay, fine then.
There you go. It's all you, my friend.
So fancy, yeah. Okay, well, here we go. We're gonna do a little bit of a tour through Gig Harbor. And of course, we have our favorite boats here, the St. Mary, the Genius, and the Shenandoah. But I will just advance a little bit here to get you oriented. So tonight, when we were discussing what we were going to want to do for this presentation, we thought, well, there's this interesting triumvirate of locations associated with Croatian boat builders and fishermen. Of course, Commencement Bay and the Tacoma waterfront is an essential area. And also Gig Harbor, and I'll give a little brief introduction to some of the boat building activities in Gig Harbor. But there's also a site on Vashon Island that was kind of the precursor to both Gig Harbor and Tacoma, which was the Martin Ulich site in Dockton, where the upper orange circle is on the map. So that was an interesting spot, because when the Scansey brothers first got started, they would buy hulls from Martin Ulich, and then they'd bring them to Gig Harbor and they'd finish them out with deck houses. It wasn't until later when they actually imported a very accomplished boatwright or shipwright from Croatia that they began to build from the keel up. So that kind of changed the face of what was possible. But even before the Scanseys, and I have a couple other maps here just at Gig Harbor, because this map is kind of interesting because it actually shows boat construction right here on this piece of the waterfront. And that's where the Scansey shipyard was located. This was another key site, which is called People's Wharf. And that was at the bottom of Sound View and at Harbor View. So there was a lot of activity happening here, mostly boats coming and going, but you had to build the boats in order to, get from Gig Harbor to Tacoma. So those were some important motivators for people here in the area. I realized I veered off the Croatian thing just a tiny bit because there were some people from Minnesota that arrived. But the Jerusich family was here, as were the Scansey family. But the Gig Harbor Logging Company actually built the first large vessel in Gig Harbor. So I felt it was important to mention that because the Vine was a lumber schooner. And this boat was built in about 1889, 1898, something like that. It's actually, I think, 1898. Sorry, I don't have my dates exact. But that's really the precursor, because the Scanseys didn't get started until 1912. But this schooner was really key to moving lumber in and out of Gig Harbor, gave the inspiration to some of the other boat builders that were working at the time. And a couple others, because people needed to get around. Of course, we have the Hunts and the Clausens, neither of whom were actually Croatian, but they did build passenger ferries and operate them. And Elsie Clausen was actually the first known steamboat captain here in the area. Of course, we get to Scansey, and they consumed quite a bit of the Gig Harbor waterfront. They started their official business in 1912, building purse seiners or finishing out purse seiners, and then they began building boats from the keel up right around 1912 or so. This is what the Scansey shipyard looked like early on, and later it became, a little more established. They built a larger building over here, but even to this day, you can see some of the rails of the ways embedded in the sand of the harbor when the tide is really low. So the Scanseys came over. Peter Scansey was the first Scansey to make it over to Gig Harbor, and he actually married Melissa Jerusich. We call the Jerusich as sort of the first family of Gig Harbor. And he married Melissa Jerusich and had a little daughter named Julia Scansey. And unfortunately, Melissa passed away pretty quickly after the baby was born. And so Julia Scansey was actually raised by her aunt, Julia Jerusich Van Waters, and grew up to marry a guy named Spiro Babbage, and kind of became the matron of the Babbage line. So this is a shot of the Scansey shipyard in Gig Harbor. And I think it's important to note that a lot of the fishermen, when they weren't fishing, they were building boats. And so, the more you fish, the more you know what you need on a boat. So that expertise really came into play as they were building different boats. These are kind of what I call the quintessential Scansey boats. The Avalon was a boat that was fished out of Gig Harbor for about 60 years and built for the Scansey family. It ultimately was deconstructed in 2015 up at Port Townsend. But we have a number of artifacts, including the wheelhouse of the Avalon, here at the museum right now. And it's going to go up to Port Townsend for the Wooden Boat Festival to kind of celebrate the Croatian history up there. So these, to me, Scansey seiners have a specific look to them. And you can, once you train your eye, you can really spot them, because they cranked out quite a few in each year for quite a few years, and they have a very similar look and style to them. Sorry, getting to my changer here. Another thing that the Scanseys built were ferries, specifically car ferries. And I think that's really an important distinction between the passenger ferries that were running all over the Sound and when cars really became a big part of our culture. Scanseys saw that, and they recognized that, oh gosh, there's a market for car ferries. So there were 4 Scansey brothers, and 2 of them predominantly stayed with the boat building trade, Mitchell, and then Joe ran some of these ferries with the Puget Sound Navigation Company. And then Andrew and Peter continued to fish. And but this was a huge endeavor for the family to build these boats, the Scansonia, the Defiance, the Willachet, and all these boats ran back and forth between Gig Harbor and Tacoma. And then, of course, later on, there's Glen Boat, and a lot of those Scansey seiners, when the Scansey shipyard pretty much shut down during World War II and after, a lot of those Scansy seiners were brought to Glen Boat to have retrofits done. And the Shenandoah, which is the 65-foot wooden purse seiner that we have here at the Harbor History Museum, was actually brought to Glen Boat to have its whole deck house rebuilt. And so in 1949, all of the shipwrights at Glen Boat were working on the deck house of the Shenandoah. And it's a pretty cool deck house, I have to say. Vast improvement over the original, because you can keep your crew out of the rain. But that has transformed. They also built gill netters there. And then this isn't what the boat shop looks like now, but it's now Gig Harbor Boat Shop. In the 1950s, it was Eden Boat. And so while not necessarily Croatian, there was a lot of connections there. And there to this day are still a lot of Croatian families that are part of the Gig Harbor Boat Shop families. So Shenandoah was built in 1925 at the Scansy shipyard, and is currently being restored for exhibition here at the Harbor History Museum. So if anyone wants to come down and take a look, they're making incredible progress right now, bringing the Shenandoah back to life so that she can be the centerpiece of our new maritime gallery. And last but not least, I want to point out this particular family because we wouldn't have the Shenandoah without these folks. So this is the only photograph I know of that shows all these sort of key people. At the center here is a fellow named Nick Bez, who this is 1921, and this is a house in Gig Harbor. So Nick Bez marries Lena Dorotich, who is the daughter of Pasco and Maddie Dorotich, and their son John. So they actually, shortly after this wedding, they get this great idea that Nick will buy a cannery up in Alaska. So he buys his first cannery in about 1924. And then Pasco and John partner to have the Shenandoah built so that the Shenandoah can be the first cannery tender for Nick's new cannery, because they've got to haul fish from the fish traps in Alaska to the cannery, because obviously cannery doesn't work if it doesn't have fish. So it's all these moving parts, and this family comes together to put these pieces in motion to build a boat, take it to Alaska, run the canneries, run the fish from the traps to the cannery. And that really launches Nick Bez's big career. And John continues to skipper the Shenandoah until 1966, when he passes away. And Pasco Dorotich came originally from Croatia, as did Nick Bez, from the Isle of Bracha, Sumartin, and they originally came to Canada and lived there. And Pasco and Maddie got married in Ladner, Canada. Their children were born there, and then they came down here to Gig Harbor. Now, I suspect they came to Gig Harbor because Maddie was a Gillich, and the Gillich family was already here. So, so family brings family together. So this is a pretty fascinating photograph. And the last person that I want to point out in this picture is Spiro Janovich, because Spiro's sons, Tony and George, ultimately buy the Shenandoah. Tony was born in 1925, just like the Shenandoah. And after John passes away, his son Tony buys Shenandoah, and she gets fished until 1998 up in the San Juans. So all these things kind of meld together to make a bigger story. That's a very quick introduction, but I'm going to turn it over to Claire now so she can talk a little bit more about what's happening where in Tacoma.
Well, that's a wonderful introduction. I was thinking as you told it, how much the immigrant stories of Croatians who came to this area had such a similar story. They all seem to come and certain things happen to them. I can tell a little bit about the story of the Petric family. We went back and checked the records in the archives in Zagreb, and found out that Yuri Petric, who was the first one to come to the United States, was listed on his marriage certificate to Katerina Budrovic as a mariner. So he was traveling, he was leaving on ships, he was going to various places. And we believe, although we don't know for a fact, but we believe that he jumped ship in Los Angeles and began to settle there. He then called for or sent money for his wife and two small children who were like 5 and 8 years old to come and join him. They came to Los Angeles. They had another child. He was actually working as a cook at that time. So mariners, cooks, fishermen, and boat builders, they all kind of mixed in there together. Anyway, Katerina Budrovich was pregnant with the fourth child, and their father died. He died in Los Angeles, and she waited until the baby was born, and didn't speak English, had 4 children now, a babe in arms, and needed to go somewhere where she might know someone. So there was a relative in Tacoma whose name, interestingly, was also Petrich, even though the 2 women were both Budroviches, but they both married Petriches, who weren't related, or were probably related, because as many Croatians in this town would know, Petrich was an extremely common name on the islands where so many of the people who came to Tacoma came from. So you mentioned Nick Bez and the Doritiches and the Scansies, they all came from Brach. Petriches came from the island right across from there, which was the island of Var. And many of the fishermen here from Dalmatia came from Var, from Brach, from Schulte, from Wies. My mother-in-law came from Wies. So, and they all, interestingly, it was a pretty closed community too. When the kids came, the story was my great-grandfather sent them off to school. They'd never had school. They insisted. Story about my grandfather was he got in an argument with one of the nuns and walked out of the school when he was about 8 years. No, I think he had to be at least 10 years old. He'd had about 6 months of schooling, and that was it. He was done. He went to work in the mills. Tacoma was an area. We're talking about 1890 to about 1900, where logging was the master of industry here in Tacoma. And of course, that made it possible for so many people to become boat builders. We had amazing timber, old growth timber, and it was straight, it was fine, and it was great to build boats with. So he didn't become a boat builder right away. He worked in the mills. And when he was there, he learned a little bit about handling machinery. So that was another skill that you had to have. And the boat builders, when the boats had machines and engines in them, they needed somebody to take care of the engines. And I think that's how my grandfather got up there, although he did row with some of the other fishermen from Dalmatia when he was a young man, and probably about 15 and 16, even though he never learned how to swim. And that's another part of the immigrant story, which is kind of interesting for fishermen and people who live in islands. I should point out that Tacoma, Gig Harbor, this area, mostly the people who came from Croatia came here because it may not have been as warm as the Adriatic, but it looked very much like the islands that they had come from. And islands that were easy, not easy to navigate, but navigable, and were rich in fish. So that was a wonderful thing. Anyway, part of this immigrant story was that the kids grew up. My grandfather started to, actually he became a builder, so he was good with his hands, even though he hadn't gone to school. Good with his hands, started to build houses. And one of the other shipbuilders by the name of Barber, also from the island of Var, helped him out by asking him to build a house. Well, times became tough in Tacoma right around World War I, and building houses wasn't as easy as it had been 5 years before. So there was a story of these 2 men who were friends. One was named Petrich and the other one was named Martinac. They got on a ferry boat one day and they were on their way over to Gig Harbor because they were going to go see their friend Scansi. And they started talking about how bad business was. And by the time they came back, where they had seen how successful the boatyard in Gig Harbor was, and how many orders were out there. And they felt they didn't want to compete with their brother from Croatia, but on the other hand, they figured that there was plenty of business and plenty of opportunities. And again, Nick Bez is the story of Nick Bez, and the cannery certainly fit into our family because my grandfather had a brother. He started a cannery up in Canada and then had Martin start building some boats. So Joe Martinac and Martin Petrich became partners, started Western Boat in December of 1916, just at the bottom of the Star Street Hill in Old Town. For those who don't know it, Old Town was the name of a town where many folks came from on the island of Var. And so in English, it's Old Town. In Croatian, it's Stari Grad, Old Town. And that was how this particular area, I think, that became in Tacoma, the center of the Croatians living here in what is still called Old Town. Anyway, the two of them started a shipyard. They needed to find somebody who actually knew how to build boats. They were both really good at building. They were good at building houses. They were good at building, but they needed to have a shipwright. And so they had a third partner, and he was great. They worked together for a couple of years. One day, Joe came in to talk to Martin and said, "Martin, how much are we paying the men who are working for us and building these boats?" And Martin said, "Well, they're taking home about $4.50 a week." And Joe said, "And how much are we taking home?" And Martin had to admit that they were only taking home about $2.30. And so Joe said, "I got to go find a job because I've got a growing family." And so he went back. He ended up working with Skanski, and then started his own shipyard in 1924. But that point that people fished in the summer and then came home in the fall and the winter and the spring and built boats was a really important thing. And these guys that were building boats, they were working practically for every single shipyard that was around. So there were the Martin Oliches, there were the Skansies, there was Western Boat, the Petrich shipbuilding, there were the Leaches on the other side of the waterway. Tacoma Boat, of course, during World War II was huge. And that was a Norwegian family that also was running, and there were several Norwegian boat builders. And so as a culture and as a community, the Croatians, the Norwegians, I'm sure they were competitive. I'd love to hear some of those stories, but I think they also had great respect for one another, and they were each doing certain things. There's some things that one of the vessels that was built by Western Boat is one that has gotten a lot of attention, and that's the Western Flyer. And I love this description because we talk about purse seiners, we talk about different kinds of boats that were built, but I think that just this description of the Western Flyer is a good one. As a purse seiner, the Western Flyer was the latest vessel type combating fishing problems with superior technology. Now we're going back to the 1920s and 1930s, and this is superior technology. Purse seiners revolutionized the way the sardine industry worked by making each fishing venture more profitable with bigger catches. Excuse me. I love it. I love it when the page turns over and it's the wrong side, right? So, excuse me, I'm going the wrong way. I will say that I just got my tooth pulled and I'm probably not knowing what I'm saying, but we're talking about the technology of the fishing fleets here. And they were talking about the high demand for fish. The purse seiner was the ship of choice because it used motors to pull in the net. Mm-hmm. Much like the drawstrings of an old-fashioned purse, a purse seiner encircles a group of fish and then closes as the fish are hauled into the boat. This method was to be successful in that the majority of the sardine population in the area became overfished and disappeared. So there's always been that argument of the fishermen were the protectors of fish because they didn't have a profession without them. On the other hand, they overfished them. And so it's just an interesting thing, I think, for all of us to look at when we're considering what it means to be a fisherman. The other quote that I wanted to just share with you about boat building, because I think it's wonderful. John Steinbeck went on his journey, wrote his first nonfiction book called The Bay of Cortez, and the Sea of Cortez, rather. And he made this comment about, and I'm sorry, he chartered the Western Flyer, which had been built in Tacoma by Western Boat. So Steinbeck says, a man builds the best of himself into a boat. He builds many of the unconscious memories of his ancestors. And I just think that's something precious to hold on to when you think about what it is to be an immigrant, what it is to bring your ancestors' knowledge and skills with you, whether you know it or not, they're part of your DNA. And as you build a boat, that's what's going into it. So
That's beautiful. That's beautiful, Claire.
Yeah, well, it's a wonderful kind of reality of this, of who our ancestors are and who the people who settled here are and how they work together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm familiar with the Western Flyers restoration project, which has been going on for some time now in Port Townsend. And I've had this strong sense of reverence, not just because of the Steinbeck connection. This is the Steinbeck's bunk, this was this table,
Right.
This is what you can read about in the book, and this is where these guys were, and this is a scene, and the boat itself is a character in that book. But also there's a reverence among the people working on it for the design and the lines. I'm not a boat person, but I've learned a lot about boats from listening to people talk about the Western Flyer. So, which is one of many boats that was built here, but she's sort of the superstar.
She is the superstar, especially with that story. It's like a boat that sank twice and then was resurrected and is on its way back and is going to play, I think, a really significant role in research that will be done not only down in the Gulf of Mexico, but also between Alaska and on the West Coast and down to Mexico. So yeah. I'm really excited about that for the future of these boats that were, put out by the scores so that folks could go and bring home the salmon and bring home every other fish that they could find. But the Western Flyer has a future too.
Absolutely. So if anyone out there is interested, I believe the Western Flyer, her next phase might be coming up soon.
They're supposed to launch it sometime soon. It's I heard May.
That's what I heard too. We can spread that. We can manifest that. How about that?
Okay, we'll manifest it. Great, Susan.
Good. So the Western Flyer Foundation has a website, and they have, I think, project updates and YouTube videos. You can watch a lot about the restoration. It is amazing how far that boat has come. Like you said, she sank twice.
Yeah,
it was a mess.
Yeah,
and she's being brought back to life. So
she fished in California, she fished in Alaska, she's fished everywhere. She's a typical fishing boat from this area with a lot of life stories to tell.
Is that a West Coast boat theme, that they're adaptable? They start out as a sardine fisher and then they become a trawler, or they become something else. They adapt.
And I think they adapt to where the fish are. They follow the fish.
Yeah, they adapt to the kind of fish too.
Yeah.
There's seiners now that are catching salmon, sardines. Sometimes they go do crab, sometimes squid. So if you're fishing around, you fish for various things based on the seasons. Yeah.
Should we talk about Pirotech and the also the technology that improved the method? You want to talk about that, Steph?
I can, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
In fact, we just did a really cool little video. We have a video series that we do here at the museum called Collections Corner, and we happen to have one of the original Pirotech power blocks. And if you're not familiar with what a power block is, it's the tool that revolutionized fishing. So purse nets had to be hauled in by hand, and there was usually a crew of about 10 people on board. And Mario Paratich or Puritich. How do you say it, Claire?
I say Puritich, but
Puritich, yeah. But they call it the Puratic Power Block.
yeah.
And so that's why I always get a little confused with the name. But Mario Puritich invented this cool thing that will haul the nets in for you. So when I think of purse seiners today, I think of them as having kind of a triangular shape because they have, the whole of the boat, and then the mast goes up the center, and then there's a boom, and the power block is mounted on the end of the boom. The net comes up through the power block, and then there's usually like 3 people on the back deck that pile the net as it comes in, and then the fish are gathered by the side of the boat and either lifted into the hold or brailed into the hold. So the power block really revolutionized everything because you could go from a crew of like 10 people down to a crew of about 5. And I think that also made the demand for boats higher because now you could have half the number of people and more people had the opportunity to have a fishing boat. And that's really an incredible piece of equipment that changed everything and are still used today. Mm-hmm.
What's kind of cool about that too is that this is about the immigrant story too that we're telling here in your series, right, Susan?
Mm-hmm.
So if you ever get the opportunity to go back to this island of Broch, where so many people in Gig Harbor and in Tacoma came from, and where Mario came from, there's still a small shipyard there. And if you climb up the hill, there's also a cemetery where he's been buried. And a lot of people come to that just because they know of the effect that Mario's block had on fishing. So it's a little shrine. So there you are. You're looking to a guy who came to the United States, designed this, built it, sold it, etc. Came back, his ashes were brought back to the island of Broch. And then as you're climbing up to the cemetery to visit that area, you'll pass a church. And in the church, there was damage done to that church. I think I don't know whether it was an earthquake or it was a fire, but then you'll find a lovely little plaque on the outside wall of the church, which says, "Thank you to the fishermen of Tacoma," of Tacoma and Gig Harbor, who have helped us rebuild the church. So I love the fact that especially among Croatians from Dalmatia, there has continued to be this going back and forth and connection with the old country.
So it sounds like it was a very tight community. You people settled here because they had family or relatives here.
Right.
Claire, you were mentioning something a while ago that people could order, they have an altar on their fishing boat. Some of the Croatian captains would have an altar
I'm not sure. I don't think the Western Flyer did because it was that much smaller. But some of the larger boats so Croatians, like the Irish, it's very similar in their population. They're about 85%. I mean, even today, they're identified as about 85% Roman Catholic. And so many of the boats that were built by the Croatians here in Tacoma had these, it's more of a niche altar that was set back, and there was always the statue of Mary, who is the Mary of the Sea. Mary, mariner. The name actually, what my grandfather was called Martin, but when he was born in Croatia, his name was Marin. And I have had other men in Croatia tell me that Marin is the masculine name for Mary, which is kind of interesting. They all changed their names to Martin, but actually it was the masculine form of Mary. So she is she's the one you go to when it gets stormy and you're not sure you're going to get home again and you are seeking assistance. And I think what's really interesting about the Marys is that if you go to China and you go to Taiwan, there are shrines and temples to the goddess Mazu, who's important for saving people at sea. She's the one who takes care of them. So I think all over the world, probably every culture that you have, especially in seafaring cultures, you're going to find a protector who probably is the goddess of the sea, the mother of the sea, the goddess of Jesus, who is this mother of the sea.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
I have to say that when we had the opportunity to go up to Port Townsend when a boat called the Fort Bragg was being demolished, and that boat was fished for, gosh, nearly 60 years by a Croatian family by the name of Mandic out of Aberdeen. But they fished a lot with the Gig Harbor fleet because they had connections, and that boat kind of had some connections here in Gig Harbor as well. But we have pictures of the Shenandoah and the Fort Bragg together. So when we discovered that that boat was slated for demolition, we knew we needed portholes for the restoration project on the Shenandoah. And that boat had them, and they were the right era and the right size. And so we did a contract with the port and were able to go collect a number of artifacts from the Fort Bragg. And we did get the portholes, and they are actually now in Shenandoah, which is really cool. But one of the other things that we were able to bring back from the Fort Bragg was the staff that is mounted up at the fly bridge that has a cord that goes from where the fly bridge wheel is back to the horn on the mast. And on that mast, not on the big mast, but the little staff that the cord is attached to, there was some beautiful little knot work and a tiny little brass cross. And it looked like
Yes.
it had probably been on it for decades.
Long time.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that
Wow.
cross has been protecting that boat for a very long time.
Right.
And yeah,
I
not
love
a
that.
boat, but another option. Yeah.
I think that fishermen are also pretty superstitious. And I think it'd be great to kind of collect what the superstitions are. That'd be fun. Maybe somebody who's listening to us knows some of the superstitions.
I think you've hit on our second series right
You
there.
got
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Tales of the Sea.
Mhm.
All right. That'd be great.
Yeah. We have a panel in the museum about superstitions at sea. So yes, it is a great topic. Yeah. And actually for a long time, women on boats were not considered, they were considered bad luck. So it took a while for women to break into the fishing business.
Well, guess what? I don't know if you all know about the dragon boats that we've had. They have the Gig Harbor races just a couple of weeks ago. But when we first went to China to race the dragon boats there, it was the first time there'd been women in those boats. And there was a team from Hong Kong that had brought a few women to be in their competitive boat too. But then we had a couple of guides who were with us, young girls who were telling us all the Chinese stories. And they said, well, you just wait. After we leave, they're going to burn that boat.
Oh my gosh. Wow. Okay.
So it's a superstition that I think still is very much alive in some places today.
Wow. Stephanie, you mentioned, what did I catch the name right? Elsie Clausen? She was
Yes.
a skipper?
She was. Over at Sunrise Beach, the Clausen family lived over there, and they were super active. I mean, she was also a mountain climber. She climbed Mount Rainier. She did all sorts of really cool things, but she did not let anything hold her back after her dad died. They had the boat, he had named his boats after his daughter, Elsie. So there was the Elsie 1, the Elsie 2. After her dad passed away, she began running the Elsie 2 and then decided she needed a better boat. So she actually ordered another one. I'm not sure which boat builder she contracted with to build the LC3, but she unfortunately did not live to actually skipper that boat because she passed away at only about 34 years old. But she was very daring and didn't let anything hold her back. And if somebody said you couldn't do something, she'd be like, well, just watch me. So she's a hero over on this side of the water for a lot of young women that are aspiring to do amazing things. And things that people tell you you can't do.
Right.
Yeah.
Love that.
So she'll be a story for us, I think, at some point, a deeper dive, because she's a character that I find really interesting. I've been doing a bunch of research on Anna Jarosich because I find her very fascinating. She's a First Nation woman who lived in Canada, grew up in Canada, married Sam Jarosich and came down here to America. And actually, I told that the wrong order. She came down here to America with them, and then was later they were actually formally married. So we actually have their wedding certificate, which is interesting. But they were a really important family here, and Sam was super involved in fishing. He and Peter Goldsmith, or Peter Zlatar, as his Croatian name was, came to Gig Harbor, and John Ferrigue, who was from Spain. I think they all met on a big sailing ship as crew members, but I don't know for sure. There's a lot of there's not a lot of sources, and there's a little conjecture mixed into the sources I have found.
Yeah.
But he did come to America originally in 1854 on a sailing ship, and then wound up going north because, of course, there was a gold rush in California, and then there was the gold rush in Canada, and there was also a large Croatian community on the south bank of the Fraser River in Canada that I'm sure he connected with as well. So the three of them were fishing, and then ultimately came down here to Gig Harbor. But in the meantime, they were also trading with the Penelakut tribe, and Anna was from that tribe, and she came down with Sam, and they lived here in Gig Harbor until they died. Sam died in 1905, and she died in 1926. But really interesting couple, and really considered they're considered the first family of Gig Harbor, because the early historians basically said, well, Peter Zlatar or Peter Goldsmith and John Ferrigue just moved on, but that wasn't the case at all. They actually stayed here until they died. Peter Goldsmith died about 80 years old, and his youngest son, Peter, also, they died the same year, 1914.
Wow.
Yeah. So John Ferrigue was actually buried in the Arndale Cemetery, same as the Jarosich family. Sam and Anna's son, John, Mike, and Sam all were fishermen. So they were all out fishing all the time. And really, the original sailing skiffs were human powered by oar. And then later they got engines. So all those guys were super strong. So
Right.
yeah, not only
Right.
were they rowing those boats around, they were hauling nets by hand, and even seining by the shore too. So
I just imagine how hard life must have been when they came originally. Just not only the hard work, but I think of like the widows who came and had children to raise, and how they did absolutely everything they possibly could, from baking bread to doing laundry to running household, places where the guys would stay, that sort of thing. It was just it's every immigrant story that you have, where we all figure out, what can we possibly do to survive?
Yeah. It seems like there's also still a lot of connection back to Croatia among the community here. I know there's a traditional boat build that's going to be, Stephanie, you maybe know more about the Batana build, the Gig Harbor.
Oh,
Batana.
yes.
Well, maybe Claire knows more too. I know it's happening at the boat shop. I know Mike, we just call him Vlahovic. Mike Vlahovic is coming over. He's currently living on the island of Brac in Sault Martin, and he'll be coming over to build this boat at the Gig Harbor Boat Shop, and then bring it up to the Port Townsend Wooden Boat Festival. So that's what I know.
Yeah, I just love these Batanas. I don't know, they're small boats, but they're cocky, and they're they're colorful, and you'll see them in small harbors all over the coast in Dalmatia. And I don't know, I just happened to be someplace where the Croatians, like you, Stephanie, in Gig Harbor, have told the fishing story, the story of boat builders and fishermen, in an absolutely wonderful way. So the Batanas have their own special story, and sometimes they have little groups of them, and they'll all have these colorful sails that they're doing, and they probably have great little competitions. Who knows? We all may love these little boats and start building them here. That would be fun, wouldn't it?
Yeah, that'd be great.
I would like one. Can I have one?
Yeah. No, you have to build it though, Susan.
Okay, I'm in.
All right.
Are they fishing boats or are they more like skiffs?
They're small skiffs, but I think they're used for fishing as well.
Okay, interesting.
Well, I'll ask Mike when he's building it. He's going to be in Gig Harbor soon, right? Building it,
I think so. I'm not sure when he's coming, but
maybe
I think
June
he's
or
given
July.
us
Yeah.
a couple of months to do it. So
Yeah.
Mhm. Oh, we should also mention on May 14th, there is the Gig Harbor, I think, boat show at the Tides Tavern.
oh, yeah, the classic wooden boat show. Mhm.
Thank you.
Super.
And if anyone wants to see a great 1920s or 30s era purse seiner, the Veteran will be on at the dock there and open for public tour, I believe. So
Yeah. I think that's the plan. And we're also trying to get the porpoise cleaned up to get down there as well. And the porpoise is really what we call the boat that gave Gig Harbor its name. So it's a replica survey vessel from the Wilkes Exploring Expedition. And it's been out of the water for a while, but there's a few of us that would really like to see that boat back in the water. And
Nice.
so people can see it. It's on display in front of the museum right now, but covered in its winter tarps. So pretty soon we'll be able to peel those back and do some work on the bright work, and hopefully the boat will be in the parade this year in Gig Harbor, and then it will get relaunched. So hopefully we'll see it down there at the Tides. Yeah.
And you still have a traditional blessing of the fleet every year in Gig Harbor.
We
So
do.
that's
In fact, the picture behind me right there, you can't see it very well, but that's a blessing of the fleet in I think 1987 or something like that. But yes, we do. On the first weekend in June, we have the maritime gig, and on that Sunday, all the fishing boats gather in the middle of the harbor, and they bring out the priests, and everybody comes out to celebrate the blessing of the fleet, and it's really quite a fun event.
So that's a tradition that came from the old country.
is it?
Yeah. Yeah, I was just thinking about all the different Croatian families that we have here in Gig Harbor. I was telling Susan and Claire that I'm working on a t-shirt design that says I have an itch, ICH.
Oh, right.
You know, Bez Milinovic, we have Janovic, we have Jarosic, we have Malic, we have Lavrovic, we have Gilic, you know, so the list goes on and on. It's a Stanic, Jadrosic. So all these different names are Croatian names that are a longtime Gig Harbor folks. And Bujisic, that's one of my favorites.
Stephanie, I heard that they honorarily call you Lilich.
Oh, Ladovic, yeah. Well, you know, when you need to blend in, you just do, right?
Right.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. Be able to pass.
I wanted to go back also to the Shenandoah, Stephanie, which is, that's never going back on the water, but it's a great interpretive project if people also want to see another. It's, you said 1925?
1925, yeah.
You were talking at one point about, not tonight, but another night, about how you're restoring it in different ways to show different time periods of the boat.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
We can be pretty creative because the boat's not going back in the water, but a lot of these work boats were modified over time. I mentioned that the deck house was rebuilt in 1949, but the bulwarks were actually refashioned as well. So in 1925, when the boat was launched, the bulwarks were much lower because they're concerned about windage on the boats. And they also didn't have electricity in the crew quarters or up in the galley. And so you had to bring in as much light as you could. So there were portholes along the side and deck prisms in the deck. And the only place that the boat had electricity was battery powered and lights above the engine. And that we know from what we call ghost lines inside of the boat, that are areas where there was conduit for lighting fixtures that we've discovered in the restoration process. But we have decided to kind of embrace this idea that the boat's not going back in the water, so we can really give her her third life as a teaching vessel in the gallery by demonstrating how the boat changed over time and using that as part of the interpretive messaging. So the port side of the boat is being restored to her, or I should say, rehabilitated back to the 1925 version of the bulwarks configuration with the portholes and everything. But we're also leaving it slightly, quote, undone, so that you can actually see the structure of the boat. So the planking, the framework, the stringers, you'll be able to actually see how these boats were constructed, because it's so fundamentally different than how fish boats are built today. The starboard side of the boat will be fully restored to about 1960. That's about 10 years after the bulwarks were rebuilt and made higher. If you're trying to catch a lot of fish, you sometimes even use your decks for when the hold gets full. And we have pictures of the boats just piled with fish. And so the bulwarks were rebuilt in the 1950s to be taller so that they could also go in heavier seas. But so that side will be fully restored to about 1960, as well as the crew quarters down below. You'll see the boat as if it is working and in action. And they're actually in the process of building a mast for Shenandoah, since her mast was removed when she was hauled out of the water to be brought to the museum. So they're building a new mast. We recently received as a gift the boom from the Majestic, which was also a 1925 Scansey seiner that Jake Busich fished for many, many years. And so it will have a new mast, but the original boom from the Majestic. So it's an interesting approach to looking at how you can actually do restoration projects that will help explain sort of the different eras of these boats and why they made different changes. And over time, they added electricity to the boat, so you could have lights down below, and you didn't need the portholes, which half the time leaked anyway. So especially in heavier seas. So those were removed and planked over. So it's really quite an interesting project, and just trying to learn as much as we can, both from boats like the Veteran that are still around, that are of a similar era. Tons and tons of research with historic photographs, old boat plans, all sorts of things that just really help us get a sense of what this boat looked like in different time periods, and so that we can share those stories as we go. And I'll just add one last thing. We don't necessarily have a Steinbeck on board our boat.
Oh,
but,
come on now.
we have, one summer. It's a one summer story. You know how it is, Claire. We had Novoselic on crew of the boat, and his dad was also a crew member. And his dad used to say, "I'm bringing him on board because this boy, all he likes to do is play the damn guitar." And well, it worked out for him. So there you go.
That is wonderful. We all need one. We all need one.
Just one summer, one guy. Yeah.
It was Hemingway you were bringing on.
Yeah. Well, I've considered that story.
Yeah.
Speaking straight.
Yeah. You may have Steinbeck, but we have Hemingway. I mean, Novoselic. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
It's exciting to see how these old boats bring new life, because when you see them munched up there in Port Townsend, and they literally have this giant machine that just goes and there's not enough, and you just look at the amount of time and effort and thought that goes into these restoration projects, and it's like you just can't say enough for the talent of the shipwrights that are working on these projects.
Right. I'll just add how much I love to see the projects that we've got going in the whole area to help kids and encourage them to learn about boat building. And it's not just the boat building that you're learning everything. It's why you understand you need mathematics, you need geometry, you need those classes. And I know the community Boatbuilders in Tacoma have just been doing a wonderful job, and they've been working with a lot of the kids from Reman Hall and teaching some fabulous things. The mentors that they're working with is been such a good thing. The Youth Marine Foundation also encouraging kids from all over the area to come, and they have a brand new vessel that's coming very, very soon. So, and I know Tacoma Schools is about to embark upon a maritime school program. I don't know what's happening in Gig Harbor, if there's anything in that way, but you're working on it. So we're all
working on it, ruminating. Yes.
It's kind of like we need to keep these industries alive because they're so important.
Yeah. Our shipwright is, a great example of that. He grew up here in Gig Harbor, and I mean, literally he and his brother were building boats since they were like 5.
Yeah.
And to this day, his kind of classic boat is what he calls a one-sheet skiff, and it's amazing what the guy can do with one piece of marine plywood. And he has a little boat in the little boats exhibit here at the museum right now called Avante, which is one that he developed that's kind of inspired by these little boats on they say it's inspired by a little Italian kind of Vespa boat. It was featured in Small Boat Magazine. And so, the boats don't have to be big and the projects don't have to be expensive, but, you really do learn a lot just by experimenting. And, I'm sure that that's how the earliest Croatian boat builders were figuring their stuff out.
Sure.
Like,
and I suspect I suspect they also got a lot of help from the Puyallup people here, the Salish people, because they're boat builders. They've been boating, they've been paddling all throughout this area, and they know the waters, and I'm sure that they were open and helping with one another in many, many, many ways, even though we may not have found those stories yet. I was just laughing when you were talking about that, though, because I was remembering the fun that we used to have when we did quick and dirty boat building as part of the Maritime Fest. And you'd have maybe 10 or 12 teams get together, 2 people. They had a day to build a boat, and then there'd be the parade, and you carry the boat down to the water, and people gathered around, and these guys get in their boats, and they're everything from bicycle boats to Visqueen kinds of boats, and to there was one, I remember the chicken that was on that boat one time, but how the crowds would gather, and the only thing the crowds cared about was the boats that were going to sink, and they were the ones that were just so excited when that great drama would occur. But there was always cheers for the winner of the race around the circle.
We used to have, years ago, before Maritime Gig, we had Harbor Holidays, and there was the Leaky Tiki Parade, and it was a similar kind of thing. People would show up with their crazy boats and see who could make a circle around the harbor and without sinking. There was a few rescue boats that were sent out during that time too.
Leaky Tiki, that's great.
Leaky Tikis, yeah, pretty awesome.
Now, would the Croatian ancestors be horrified by these boats?
I don't know. I think there was probably a few Croatians that were participating. To be honest.
Yeah, I'm sure they did. They used to have what is it? When you a tug of wars among themselves.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, you were mentioning how the communities kind of grew, and we haven't mentioned things like the Slavonian Hall, those numbers of organizations that exist in this community. There were 2 groups of Slavs that were here, at least in Tacoma. There was the group kind of from the inland that tended to work over at the smelter, and then there were the fishermen. So each of them has their own hall. But it was what was necessary for immigrants when they came, because there was no social service system. There was no safety net. And so when people were killed either on the boats or they died of disease, it was places like the Slavonian Hall that provided the money to have a funeral, to bury the person who had died. Those kinds of things were what these social clubs did, how they helped one another. So I think they play a really important role in understanding what it was like to be in this community in those days. Point. Yeah.
Is there anything like that in Gig Harbor, Stephanie? Like Slavonian Hall?
It's pretty much called the Gig Harbor Fishermen's Club.
Yeah.
I mean, that
would be it.
Yeah, because that's predominantly, made up of folks of Slavonian descent or Croatian descent. Mhm.
Wow.
Right.
Well, I love how it was a tight community, but also they, like Stephanie, you were saying earlier, they shared some of the boat building among the different boatyards. Like one yard would start the keel and someone else would finish off with the deck. So I never knew that before you told me that.
Well, I just learned it kind of by accident. I was trying to learn more about Docton and the Martin Olich shop over there, and then learning the early days of the Scansey Boatyard. And, really people start with what they can do, right? So if you're really good at cabinetry and finished work and all that, why not focus on that to get yourself
Yeah.
going and, get holes from someone who is really good at building those. And it's an interesting approach, but it makes a lot of sense really when you think about it. Yeah.
Well, I'm recognizing that we are at our 1 hour mark and I want to respect everyone's time. Thank you so much to both of you. We will be posting this so we can share this video around. There's a lot of great information here tonight, and I'm just so grateful to both of you.
Susan, thank you for just the fun of being able to talk about the things we love, right?
That's right. All kinds of good info out there. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. To be continued.
That's right.
Okay.
That's
Have a
wonderful.
lovely evening.
Thank you so much. It's great to see you both.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Good night.
Bye.